And you mentioned how you gave yourself a deadline to start this app. When that deadline passes, you go, "I'm all in." What happens the next day? Like, what is going all in? What does starting this actually look like?
I created my pitch deck. I started putting together my list of investors I was going to reach out to, and then COVID hit. So that was about a year ago. And so I paused while I kind of figured out what was going to happen with COVID and if I believed more in the idea, less in the idea, and kind of took the summer to say, okay, like let's see what happens with COVID. And then every month that would go by, I would wish, like, I wish I'd done it. I wish I'd gone and raised. I wish I'd done it a month earlier before COVID. And so I just made the decision again. I said, okay, you're in or you're out. And I decided to dive in again for the second time and raised capital in September, all through Zoom. I actually did it in this very room. That's why I chose to make this call here today too, is that I do have an office. This is not where I work from. But when I was pitching investors, one thing I really thought about in advance is where am I going to feel most comfortable? And the place where I'd feel most comfortable is sitting on my couch in my den. And I kind of joked around. I'm like, hey, like VCs normally bring you into their den. Like you're down in the valley and you're going from like one location to the next where it's their office. And I literally was bringing them into my den and saying, no, this is where I'm comfortable. This is where I'm going to pitch from.
Mhm. And so that was that an angel round, that first round?
Pre-seed, that was the
Mhm.
3.5 million that was announced
Okay.
on in February. We raised that in the fall, but didn't announce it until we were ready to launch the app.
Got you. So talk to me a little bit about that fundraiser. So you said $3.5 million. I have the quote here. Leading Silicon Valley VCs are some of the investors. So first off, congratulations on the raise. That's huge.
Thank you.
I'm curious. So with the raise, one thing that's people get, I feel like they misconstrue when it comes to raising investment is people get they focus on the dollar amount, which of course is important. The whole reason you're raising capital is to have money to grow a business, but equally as important is also the investors themselves that are coming into the company. So what did you look for in the investors you were bringing into Snack beyond just like they're going to write this check? Like what were you looking for in the investors, whether it be their networks themselves?
I was really lucky in that I had multiple term sheets that I was kind of picking between, and actually part of it, me deciding who I went with, came down to wanting to ensure I was able to bring particular individuals in. Um, so it's really people I trusted that I thought would have a good sense and people that could be my sounding board for when I was working on something or needed help with something. And I did a mixture of funds and angels, and they've been a phenomenal group of individuals. I've enjoyed the last 6 months of working with them. It's been a really, really great experience. And I know not everyone has that. I did carve out 25% for Canadian investors, and that was something kind of going back to I want more successes in Canada. So I did carve out that 25% for Canadian investors to include them as part of this. But I did go down to the valley and kind of get my valuation, get the lead investors, and then kind of came back to them and said, here's what it is. Are you interested in participating?
Okay. And so you said it was in the fall. Like how long was the raise until like how many months, weeks was it?
3 weeks.
Wow. And how many pitches a day is that?
Whew. I would pitch probably starting at 8 in the morning and go to 6 at night. Pretty much straight through. I think a lot of people, and I've said this a few times now, a lot of people talk about the pitch and how important your PowerPoint is. But I actually probably spent, yes, I did my diligence and I made sure my deck was great and it was 5 pages and very light and didn't really say very much, but it worked obviously. But it was the process leading up to it and taking the time to really identify who the right funds were for the round that I was raising, who the right partners were at those funds to participate. And every fund has partners for different types of investments. And then also, what is it that they were kind of looking for? How much do they typically contribute? And then I would go through my LinkedIn and I'd say, okay, who's a connection that's connected to them? And I would ask those people, how well do you know them? Would you be comfortable introducing me? And I did all that prep in advance before I started pitching. And I think that's what people don't realize is they kind of go into pitching and be like, great, I'm going to pitch my 5 funds and they'll do cold outreaches and they'll do this and they'll do that. Where I spent probably a month getting myself ready to start pitching. And that I think is what led to more success in that round than the actual pitch itself.
That's super key. I work with an investor just doing some content stuff for him. And one thing he always says is he very, very, very rarely, 99% of the time, will only take an introduction if it's a warm intro. He won't take a
Yeah,
cold introduction. He won't take a cold email, like just because there's so much coming inbound anyways, that like just that warm intro is like a filter. And he says the one way to
100%.
do, yeah. And he said the one way to kind of get, if you don't have a connection, is to do that research like you've done and to send a detailed, not detailed, but like an email that shows you've done your background and that you're reaching out to this person for a specific reason because what you're pitching them will be of interest to them because of everything they've invested in the past. So I think that's a super important thing for entrepreneurs to hear, the fact that you did all that prep work first. How do you handle when, because you're doing pitches 3 weeks, 8 to 6 every single day? It was a competitive round. So there's a lot of people who wanted to get on this, but I'm assuming there were still people who passed on it. How do you handle that, for lack of a better word, rejection? And then how do you determine what feedback to take into your pitch in the business and what not to? Because I interviewed Mikhail Cho, who's the co-founder of Unsplash, and he said one thing they dealt with, especially early on, was mentor whiplash, where you have two people of equal stature with very similar success giving you the opposite types of feedback. So it was like whiplash because they were getting completely different feedback. How do you kind of filter through what feedback to take in and what not to over the course of this crazy 3 week pitch sprint, for lack of a better word?
So I would say the only person or group that definitively said no to me was the very first one I pitched. And so that's a piece of advice, and they were a good fund. Don't pitch a good fund as your first fund. Do a bit, at least one practice round, if not two. But they're the only ones that definitively on like said no at the first after the first kind of conversation. Everyone else at least had two, three, four, and it just got to the point where a lot of them were I was moving faster in the round, and other funds were moving faster than what they were willing to do, and that's why they dropped out. Um, what I would do with my pitch and the way I approached the whole process was how can I learn from this? How can I I kind of viewed it as being when else do I get to have this many amazing, smart people thinking about my company and what I'm building for 30 minutes or an hour at a time? Like, no, at no other point do you get those introductions. Do you get to have those conversations? Do you get to seek their advice? And some of it you'd file it in the back of your mind and be like, okay, that's interesting. Let me see if I hear that again. And if you heard it multiple times, then it's obviously something you should be thinking about. Other things and questions that they would ask, I would make sure I'd adapt my presentation so that I preempted those questions for the next time. So if I was going to my fourth meeting and I'd heard a question already, how do I just make sure I cover that really quickly in whatever I'm talking about so I know that question gets kind of it's a non-starter. They don't even have to think about that one. So I think that's really important is as you're hearing questions, make sure you're adapting your pitch. And as you're hearing objections, figure out how you can adapt your pitch around those objections. And it's like a living document or living, I didn't adapt my actual deck, but I adapted how I talk.
Mm. And how do you keep track of everything? Not just the feedback, but also there was multiple calls. So like, how do you know who's proceeding to a third or fourth call? Like, do you have a spreadsheet somewhere to track everything you do?
Color coded with about 20 different colors in it, depending upon which stage each one's at, which one's out, which one's in, which one do I need to follow up with, which one am I still waiting for an intro from? You name it, it's got a color behind it.
I love that. I don't know if you ever use Notion, but like that is the app I use to track and not fundraising, but whatever I'm doing. Like it's just so I was just curious what your method for tracking
Oh,
everything
I'm
was.
just a Google sheet. I'm pretty lame when it comes to that, but it's color coded Google sheet.
And you mentioned kind of before the podcast how you've already jumping into another fundraise. Now, granted, the original raise, the pre-seed came back in the fall. You just announced it in February. So we're March, April here. The episode, by the time people listen to this, it's going to be May. Why did you jump into another raise so soon? I've talked to other people on the podcast and they said timing your raise is super important. So why was now the time to raise money again?
I didn't intend to raise. When the TechCrunch article came out in end of February, I got a lot of outreach from people that were interested and loved what I was doing. And ultimately, that's what kind of led to this. And there's a few really key people that came forward and said, I want to put money in. And the previous round was closed and it was full. And so I thought, how do I get them in? And I'm like, okay, well, I guess I'll open up a safe. And then I thought, well, if I'm going to open up a safe for them, who else should I be bringing in? And then the conversation just kind of quickly snowballed. And if I'm honest, right now is super hot for consumer apps. There's a lot of opportunity to raise capital, and with the TechCrunch article, we got more press pickup than what we anticipated. So our original launch strategies of going into particular cities or particular states and kind of slowly growing liquidity in each of them kind of got blown out of the water. We have signups in Japan. I don't know how they heard about us, but it's great and it's awesome. And what that meant is that we're having to accelerate the growth of our team and hire roles that we probably wouldn't have hired for 4 or 5 months and bringing them on faster, but also spending a little bit more in marketing and making sure that we can generate liquidity because from a dating perspective, it's really important that there's enough people in your locale or close by that you'd be interested in. So where we might have gone slower and been a little bit probably more risk adverse, which probably comes more naturally to me, I've decided to raise the additional capital and then take advantage of the current state of the market and the excitement behind what we're building. And when I talk to our current customers, they tell me how much they love the app. They're like, you can see it, and that absolutely this is going to be the right format to date in. It's just they want more people on the app. So we've heard them, and that's definitely part of why we're doing this.
Was there any thought during the pre-seed round to do an oversubscribed round?
Um, One of the term sheets was for more than what I took. At the time, I was pretty convinced that 3.5 million was great. Originally, I was asking for 3 million. So 3.5 was more than I initially planned for. But it's more the speed to market and the ability to move faster that I think now is the right time to raise that additional capital. And when I talked to my initial investors about it, I think there was some hesitation to start with. And then when I explained to them kind of what I was seeing in the market and why I thought it was the right time, they all jumped on board and they all said, yes, of course it makes sense.
Mhm. I mean, you don't have to answer this, but I'm assuming because it's so popular and like there's some people that want in and the app is growing fast that you can raise on better terms than if you'd raised back when it was a pre-seed round. So it probably benefits you in the long run anyways. But talk to me now about growing the app in terms of a user base.